Yeah, no doubt about that. And now I want to talk about a co-main event that I think we can guarantee will not be boring.
Oh, let's hear
and
it.
that is the curveball that we all got thrown this week. So stepping away from the Sphere event now and looking forward ahead for things to come.
Yeah.
Charles Oliveira versus Michael Chandler 2.
Big one.
As the co-main event, UFC 309, Madison Square Garden.
Rematch.
Rematch. And, you know, I was actually at the first fight here in Houston.
Oh, great.
And it was great. You know, Michael Chandler had a great first round, and then Charles Oliveira came out and sealed the show in the second. Yeah. So I think the most interesting thing to me is that earlier in the week, Dana said, you know, Conor's going to fight early next year.
Right.
And so then it's like, okay, now we're getting some movement. Now we're getting some momentum towards McGregor coming back.
And Chandler finally has a date.
Right. And then, okay, Chandler's got himself a date now. And then boom, Oliveira versus Chandler. And he said, well, Chandler just got tired of waiting. And it's like, well, he's been waiting for 2 years.
Right.
And now you just said, you know, Conor's coming back now. And Dana's been very close to the hip to say Conor's coming back. He always says when asked, when Conor's ready, we'll let you know.
Right.
But now he's saying, okay, I'm not going to give you a firm date. I'm not going to give you a UFC number like, you know, 311, 312, 3, but I'm going to tell you it's going to be early next year. So it's, okay, now we have some clarity. And then they hit you with the Chandler versus Oliveira 2, which I'm not mad at that fight at all. I'm glad that Michael Chandler's coming back. I think he deserves a high-profile fight. He deserves a co-main event fight. Charles Oliveira is a really good competitor for him stylistically. We saw great back and forth in their first outing.
Yeah.
And, you know, to me, honestly, we don't know if Conor's even coming back.
Right.
We always think that he will because Dana, you know, says when he's asked about Conor that, yes, he's coming back, but we don't know. And we just kind of, to some degree, have to take him at his word. But now you have Dan Hooker, who's inserted himself into the equation after his great win over Matus Gamrot. And so it just makes sense for Chandler to say, you know what, screw it, put me back in there, give me an exciting fight. If things shake out with Conor down the road, then so be it. But, you know, I can't, in my late 30s now, continue to sit out for a guy who I don't know if he's coming back or not. So thoughts on that, and then also thoughts on stylistically, just touch on it briefly because we'll make a full prediction in episodes to come. But, you know, stylistically, how this rematch could play out, especially with Chandler having been off for 2 years.
Well, I know we saw the fight one time, but that's the kind of fight that every UFC fan would be excited for if it happened every fight card.
Yeah.
Right? Like that fight was nothing but exciting while it lasted. You had people getting dropped on both sides, and it makes a lot of sense. And I feel for Chandler not getting the fight. I love that Dan Hooker inserted himself. And in my opinion, you know, we're not breaking news over here, but I'll give you my opinion. I think Hooker's getting that fight.
Yeah.
It's either Hooker or when they say early next year Conor, they mean sometime February, March, and maybe he fights the winner of Oliveira versus Chandler. But again, that's a tough fight.
Or Holloway for the BMF, depending on what happens with Topuria.
Yeah, now that's a big one too. And you know, that would be worth delaying the Topuria fight, but I don't think they're going to do that. I think they are going to push Hooker in there. It just makes sense timing-wise for Hooker to get that shot. And I think it's a winnable fight for Conor, and they see that as a good opportunity to get him back in the mix. He's not even really in the mix. But yeah, I think the Oliveira fight versus Chandler, it could have gone either way because it was electric the entire time it lasted last time. And Chandler understands, like, okay, so there's two thoughts that go through a guy like Chandler's mind. I've wanted to be a world champion since the day I put on wrestling shoes for the first time. And I want to be a big prize fighter that fights for the biggest prizes. And he was sort of given those two opportunities. And look, Chandler is not at fault for this. He is only playing the game the way you play it. If Conor McGregor wants to fight you, you put everything else aside and you focus on that. Now, when you have to wait 2 years, you do have to start to think, okay, I'm not getting any younger. Yeah. My title shots are dwindling by the day, and I believe in myself enough to still be the best fighter in the world. You don't think you're going to be the world champion unless you think you can be the best fighter in the world. So Chandler had to say, okay, look, I still believe in my skills. I still believe I will fight Conor McGregor at some point, but I got to go do something else. I got to get active. I got to be busy. And I think this is the right move for Chandler, because if he wins this fight against Oliveira, now you're talking about potentially a title fight or just being in the wings, being one of the guys that they're talking about.
And they may have promised him that. They may have said, look, Islam's going to come back after this injury.
fight Arman.
He's going to shake things out with Arman. You get past Oliveira, we'll put you in there against the winner of Islam versus Arman. And maybe to Chandler, he's like, okay, at the end of my career now, I've made a lot of money since I've come to the UFC. This would be a nice staple. Let me win this fight against Oliveira and get back in there for a title one more time and see if I can snag that UFC undisputed title.
Right.
And that could be better than that's the proverbial bird in the hand versus the two in the bush with Conor that you don't know if it's actually going to pan out.
Right, and they say Conor's pay is 10x what Chandler would usually get paid. And so I can see why you would want to wait, rather than fight 10 times to make the money you'd make for one fight.
Which I find that hard to believe myself, honestly.
Yeah, me too, but Conor said it, and so now there's some legs to it, right? He says anything on Twitter, and it gets some motion. So whether it's true or not, I'm sure that was the biggest fight for him to possibly make. It's the biggest fight anybody can have in the UFC. So I do want to see Chandler versus Conor. Stylistically, I think it's a great matchup, but we do got to see Chandler's must-see TV.
Yeah.
He's such an exciting fighter.
And so is Charles.
To have a guy like that on your roster and have him not fighting for 2 years is a shame. And look, I don't blame him for waiting for Conor. I would have done this exact same thing, but I think he knew it was time to take his oars out of the water for that one and move on, look for that title. And of course, if he can get to a title shot or a fight with Islam, a #1 contendership, now that sweetens the deal for Conor McGregor. I don't think we don't see Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. I think we do see that fight at some point. It just makes more sense for him to get a rematch with a guy he's already felt. Of course, he didn't get his hand raised against Oliveira, but there were moments in that fight where it could have gone Chandler's way.
He could have sealed that show.
It could have been a first-round knockout against a former champion, a dominant former champion, somebody who has the most finishes in UFC history, right? We're talking about a legit fighter, and Michael Chandler was in that fight all the way through. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think Conor McGregor has a ton of history in New York City in MSG, right? Everybody thinks about the Dolly and 205 and everything like that. So I believe they're going to have Conor McGregor front and center at MSG in November for the heavyweight title fight of the world and that co-main event. And you'll probably see Conor McGregor get brought in, whether he's fighting them or he's fighting Hooker. I think that Conor McGregor will play a role at the MSG card. And whatever happens in the division, whether Islam defends his title again, whether Oliveira wins and screws things up for Chandler, or they have to just start mixing the deck a little bit, there's a lot of good options. And I think Conor McGregor really does need to be selective with who he fights next. It's got to be a smart fight that he can possibly win. No easy fights are on the docket for Conor McGregor, but if you've got one that you can give him, it's either Dan Hooker or Michael Chandler. Those are my favorite fights for Conor stylistically that I think he could win. Again, Dan Hooker after his last performance will probably be the favorite on that one.
Should be.
But I think there's a case to be made for Conor McGregor to come back and get his hand raised against either one of those guys. But of course, the sport moves on whether Conor McGregor's in it or not. And Michael Chandler has to realize that nobody's going to wait around for him. So you don't want to wait around 2 more years and be 40 years old and then just have to retire. Look at Stipe. People thought Stipe retired. Yeah. And it's been 4 years or so since we've seen him fight. And that's just never a good thing for the fight. Because now people are disrespecting Stipe about his ability to fight with John Jones, his ability or his reasoning for getting a title shot. It's like, you guys forgot this is Stipe Miocic. Now, I understand it's been 4 years since we've seen him fight, but this is still Stipe. So Conor McGregor
had the heavyweight GOAT status that gave him that negotiating power to be out 4 years. And nobody, hardcore MMA fan is really truly behind the Stipe John fight. Everybody wants it to be Aspinall, but we're all like, okay, he's the heavyweight GOAT, most knockouts in heavyweight history, most title defenses in heavyweight history. That's not where Chandler is. Chandler is just a good contender who's exciting, so he doesn't have that same leverage to sit out 4 years and still get his way.
Right, and the delays in this heavyweight title fight aren't Stipe's fault. We had a torn pec on John Jones' side. We had all sorts of things taking place, and Stipe was kind of just left on the sidelines. And I think it's cool because the heavyweight fighters, the heavyweight division moves slower than all the other divisions, right? It's the most dire consequences in that division over anything else. So it's kind of on brand for that division to move slow. Now, 4 years is a snail's pace. I'd love to see this fight have happened in March or whatever, but we'll take it when we can get it. MSG, it's going to be a special night for them. I think, obviously, we're not breaking that fight down right now, but I think it's a good fight, and obviously the co-main event is going to be hard for them to compete with for fight of the night because if my memory serves me, Oliveira and Michael Chandler left with a bonus after
yeah.
their last fight, and it's going to be hard for Stipe and John to outdo that. But man, that co-main event is really something special, and I think by the end of this year, we're going to have some answers for the 155 division, the most appreciated division throughout time in the UFC's history. So I think Michael Chandler taking the fight against Charles Oliveira, even though it's a rematch, is the right move for Chandler.
Yeah, and I'll leave you with one more question to think about. Let's say, for example, they do, and this may have factored into Chandler's decision-making. As you said, the sport moves on, and it does.
Very
And
fast.
nobody's immune to that, including Conor.
Right.
Let's say, for example, they do make Conor McGregor versus Dan Hooker,
Right.
and they put that at the top of a pay-per-view bill in 2025. Is that the highest grossing pay-per-view of 2025? I can't, affirmatively say yes to that.
Yeah.
We don't know after these years off and these losses if Conor's going to pull 1.5 million pay-per-view buys, 2 million pay-per-view buys, certainly not 2.5 like he pulled with Khabib.
Right.
Can Conor come back and draw more than an Alex Pereira versus Tom Aspinall,
Yes.
or John Jones versus Tom Aspinall, or let's say Ilia Topuria gets a few solid, let's say finishes Max Holloway, finishes somebody else, and then he goes up and fights Islam. Does Conor versus Dan Hooker or Conor versus Michael Chandler draw to that level? I don't know. And so I think that it's worth asking that question and pondering, is that potentially part of the reason why Chandler is now going in a different direction? He's like, you know what? I can't get the fight right now, but me versus Oliveira, everybody loved that the first time. It works the second time. MSG, I got the GOAT. The only people walking out after me are the two GOATs, the GOAT of the heavyweight division and the GOAT of the sport. Maybe that to Chandler was more enticing.
Yeah, well, and to use Michael Chandler's fight name, he was ready to strike while the iron was hot, and now the iron has cooled down.
Yeah.
Right now, there's not a whole lot of movement on that fight, so we've kind of just been waiting for it. But there's not been any news. Conor McGregor is a genius when it comes to staying in the headlines. He hasn't fought in a long,
Years,
long
yeah.
time, and he still steals all the headlines every weekend. And anytime he tweets, it gets more reactions and everything like that than anybody else. So while I love your optimism for the boys in the back and the ability for the UFC to put on events equal to or bigger than Conor McGregor's, but if I'm being completely honest, the return of Conor McGregor, even if this is the last time we see him, this is still going to be a $1 million+ pay-per-view buy. I don't think if you put Sugar Sean, Alex Pereira, and John Jones on a card that it would do. I think that's how stacked you'd have to have a card to compete with Conor McGregor, even in 2024 or 2025 when he comes back. I just think that the return of Conor McGregor is, you're good for 1 million pay-per-view buys when Conor fights.
Right, but I'm saying, so yes, Conor Holloway for sure. Like, let's say it's BMF McGregor versus Holloway for the rematch. That for sure would do that. I'm wondering, my question specifically is, does Dan Hooker versus Conor move the needle in that big of a way?
Well, I think so, because I think Conor's still in that point where it doesn't matter who he's fighting. He's a household name. He is all over pop culture. The world stops and pays attention when Conor McGregor's fighting. And I mean, you see it. You go, if you follow famous people on social media, they don't post anything about the UFC ever. But when Conor McGregor's fighting, you see it on everybody's story.
Yeah.
That everybody wants their picture with Conor, or they want to, act like they're a friend of his. The biggest celebrities in the world show up when Conor's there. They're in the front row, and then they're all watching around the world. So I think Conor still has that ability because he's blasted past the world of MMA. He's
just a straight up celebrity.
He's pop culture. Yeah. I mean, he's talking about running for office in Ireland. And quite honestly, we have people all the time. I know I'm
Manny Pacquiao did it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm veering off of the MMA world for just a moment, but people always say all the time, if Kim Kardashian ran for the United States presidency, there's a good chance she could get at least a whole lot of votes.
Yeah.
And while Conor McGregor is maybe not as big as Kim Kardashian is, I think per capita, Conor McGregor in Ireland is more adored and known than Kim Kardashian is in America. So crazier things have happened. I could see Conor inserting himself in politics, but I do think there is a little bit left on the Conor McGregor experience, and I think we do need to see him fight a couple more times. fighting Michael Chandler would be a really fun one. I don't think it matters who he fights next. He's still going to break 1 million pay-per-view buys, especially because it's going to be a return. All of these theatrics of a Conor McGregor fight week are going to be there. The promotion spares no expense whenever it's time to push a Conor McGregor thing. They'll do a worldwide press tour. They'll do everything they have to do to make sure that thing goes over 1 million pay-per-view buys. And unfortunately, the UFC just doesn't have anybody else that can support that kind of performance and those kind of numbers. So I think the only way the UFC finds a comparable version of a pay-per-view to what Conor McGregor can do is they got to stack it up. There's got to be 3 title fights on the line, and they got to be 2 or 3 of the top 5 draws in the sport all on the same night, which business-wise doesn't make a ton of sense for the UFC. So I think Conor McGregor is still the biggest name. I don't think that's going to change for a while, and I think even when he comes back, it's going to be over 1 million. I don't think it'll break his top 5 biggest pay-per-views, but it'll sit there in 6 through 10.
I think that's a